And whenever I was asked to speak at BlendConf, I had like no idea what I should prepare. And mostly I've been into like really heavy tech conferences. And I was asked back in January, and I spent the past few weeks, few months trying to brainstorm these ideas. At the time, Paperless Post, where I work, we were going through a lot of different changes, and I'm always trying to think of how can we better work together with, I'm just going to group them as designers and developers. So I think with this topic that I'm bringing here today kind of hits this whole idea of what blending is, at least I hope so. So where I got this idea from and what I wanted to experiment was last year I went to SaaSconf and I was on a panel with a bunch of other front-end developers, and we were constantly talking about pattern guides and how we can put different tools together so that developers could work better. And at the time, it's like we're talking about like, how do I communicate with our designers? How do we build this relationship together? In the past year, I'm not sure if anybody here is familiar with my company, but Paperless went through a whole bunch of changes. We moved offices, we moved into downtown Manhattan in the financial district, and we, yay Wall Street. We got some more money, and the whole thing was like, oh, we have all of this stuff now, we got money to pay people, let's just hire a bunch of people. And after all of that, I feel like now I finally have some experience to talk about how we actually went about bringing on new people, we're still bringing on new people, and how we are making it work across disciplines so that we can really like effectively translate these designs into something that's actually going to end up on the web. And surprise, surprise, it's not as simple as just talking to one another, because if that were true, this whole communication thing would be solved. And I'm assuming you're here because you have problems communicating with other people on your team. Otherwise, what are you doing here? If you have it solved, I would like you to tell me. But through all of this, it's like we as humans, we communicate in many other different ways, and all of these things factor into how we have our relationships with our teams. So here's just a few. We obviously verbally talk to one another. We have verbal expressions. We're like happy when we're talking about stuff we like, or maybe we'll cross our arms. We have different body cues. I don't like what you're talking about, and I think you're dumb or something. We have our written language. We have the code that we write. And we have experiential learning. We go to conferences, or we have lightning talks, and we're sharing our knowledge and communicating what we know and communicating what we're working on this way. And then there's so much more. So today, a lot of this is my opinion and what I found working at Paperless. So we've been bringing on new people, and we have changed a lot, and we've really needed to adapt. And so I'm going to take a step back and talk a little bit about myself, where I've been, and maybe why you should listen to me. So I've done full stack development in the past. So I did like database work, Ruby on Rails, JavaScript, HAML, SAS, CSS, whatever. So I have experience in a lot of that stuff. But whenever I moved to Paperless Post, I've been more concentrating on front-end development, and I'm really passionate about creating tools for other developers to use. I've been everywhere from a small startup of 4 people, went bad really quickly, so I've been there, and I've also been in really large corporate settings where they've been around for hundreds of years, like American Express. I mean, that's crazy, right? So I've seen both extremes, and this is the first time where I'm going from a startup and in this process of growth of where they're trying to figure out where they're going. And I think that's a unique viewpoint, or a unique thing that you get to see. So this company is trying to figure out, like, where are we going in these waters? Like, how do we keep this all together and move the ship forward? So if you can take anything away from this presentation, I'm hoping that you'll be able to see paperless post as a case study of how a startup transitions into a more non-startup-y entity. You'll learn some techniques for dealing with interdisciplinary team members. You'll think of new ways of how to communicate and collaborate with your teammates, and that you will also learn to document these different things that you're doing, your knowledge, and putting it into easily distributed formats so that everybody, whether or not you're a designer or a developer, has access to this information. So paperless post, what do we do? In a nutshell, we create cards, events, stationery for use on the web, so you get this whole card creation process. And about a year and a half ago, we actually launched an actual paper version, so our name's a little bit ironic. We came about because our co-founders wanted to find a nice way and a nice designy way to send cards, because they thought whatever else was existing out there just didn't cut it. And so we've always been a design company. However, we're also very technical. Our dev team has ballooned considerably in the past year, and it's still ballooning. We still find needs for more tech people. So what Paperless also needs to figure out is that our tech team has different needs than our design team, and we're trying to figure out how does that need to change. For the most part, whenever I got there, we were extremely flat. I was reporting to the CTO, but there were like 50 of us all reporting to the CTO. That didn't make any sense, right? Like, I never even talked to him sometimes. So how do we actually deal with that? Okay, so startup growing pains. So how does my startup grow? Paperless Post in a couple weeks is going to be 5 years old. So we're not really still new, but we're not old enough to have like really a good process set down just yet. We still had really low numbers for a long time up until this past year, but like we're ballooning and we're just keep growing, and we don't see that stopping anytime soon. The good thing about Paperless Post is that we've been charging our users since day one. So we've always been getting money. We never had to figure out that problem of, oh my gosh, we have this idea, but we've been giving it for free this entire time. How do we actually get money for what we're doing? So at least we got that figured out. So we didn't have to go through the problems that most startups had. But we have more problems that we have to think about, such as how are we going to cultivate our company culture? How do we keep this tight-knit family that the company is, but still grow, keep our ideals, and then also be flexible for the type of new needs that we need, and at the same point not alienate people who have been there for those 5 years. And that's a really tricky thing, especially since we were extremely flat as a development organization, and we need to start having levels. We need to have people report to each other and kind of like manage products. How are you supposed to like get those levels without making people feel like, oh, this guy, we brought in this new director, he doesn't know us, or people getting promoted. It's a very tricky thing. So at the startup, we're still trying to figure out what we're going to grow into. At a large publicly traded company, this type of process was already figured out for us. So I just kind of like sat down at my desk, I did my work, I shipped it and done. And that's simple, but now we have to kind of think about like, well, who's in charge of this and who else needs to know about that, and am I going to be affecting somebody else? So at Paperless, we all started as one team, and once we started growing, we started breaking off into these feature teams. So now we have this experience of this card creation. We make a card. That is a team of people who concentrate on that. We have the host tool side. They are in charge of somebody who has created an event and now is managing the guest, managing how information is getting to them. And then we also have the receiver side. These people are actually getting these cards. Then after they receive those cards, we want to then transition them into paying users for one of our other products. From these teams, we then have individual members, such as myself, who's a front-end developer, that is then part of another specialty team of front-end teams. So we also need to communicate with each other, keep a consistent way that we are writing our code, but also teaching other people in these other teams. So how do we actually keep all of these teams working together? And my animation's really silly, but I always feel like I'm running around trying to figure out what other teams are working on. And I don't know if that's particularly the best way to do my job, or should people just kind of know like when they're supposed to raise something? Is that a project manager's job? I'm not sure. That's where my hypothesis comes into play here. So I'm really looking to find out how can we effectively communicate across teams, across these all disciplines, everywhere from design to development. So we really have to make an effort to communicate in each other's language. And if we can't communicate in that language, we need to create a new form to communicate in which to transfer these ideas. So I'm going to take a guess here. Are there any designers in the audience? Hello? Hello. Thank you for coming. You're bold. So what's your impression of working with developers? You feel free to like. You think it's on the developer?
Yeah. Well, my impression of working with them is very individual. You know, I don't really try to blanket them all into those are the developers.
Okay.
You know, if they're very good at what they do, they're very process oriented. From what I've seen, they want to solve a problem cleanly and efficiently. They want authorized code. I do a little bit of front end coding too, so I find they don't really want me necessarily trying to commit to Git repos because I don't necessarily follow their processes as cleanly and as detailed fashion as they do, and so they have some apprehension about that.
Yeah.
They hand me something, tell me to improve the user interface, and I do all of it.
Yeah, so do you ever work with them, and do you ever like try to communicate, but you're not doing it the way I'm seeing it? Do you have that issue?
When we have those opportunities, I'd like to see us have more. Our organization tends to be a little bit more, I could even say agile. You know,
Yeah.
We're brought in at different parts. It's not really very well defined.
Uh-huh.
It's something that I want to learn more about helping our organization and even my team do more effectively because we don't do it that well. And so the times that we have gotten together and done some whiteboarding, I love having whoever's going to be building the thing I'm supposed to be designing right next to me. I want to communicate those ideas with them. I want us to both be on the same page. So, you know, I hate being brought in the middle of a project.
Yeah.
So I know everybody else does too, but I'm not sure how, to go back.
Yeah. Well, hopefully I can help you a little bit today. And do you have like a similar experience as well?
Somewhat. I mean, I would say that like in both my current job and the job before that, the working experience has been better when there's more of like a shared responsibility or as far as like the end product. So what I mean is rather than like a designer making the design, handing it off to engineers, they build it, and then maybe they know certain details they don't get right, or I overlook certain like shortcomings of a platform or whatever. Rather than doing it like that, if I'm doing some of the presentation layer code myself, or I'm working with them, sitting side by side, it's a lot better. It's, it ends up being a better product and less
Cool.
time wasted and stuff like that. So I feel like there's also like there's less animosity.
Yeah.
There's like we
Yeah.
make an effort to learn the other's craft a little bit, just so that you sort of understand some of the pain points and try to take some of the burden off of them. So.
Excellent. Well, that's really cool. And thank you for coming. That's a great point that you've brought here. I've had, not in my current situation, but in previous jobs, I've had designers who just like really don't want anything to do with developers. Like they get frustrated that we don't build it exactly to spec, and they're like, well, I put like 50 pixels here, why isn't it 50 pixels? So I was interested in seeing if maybe designers felt like they had some type of, like maybe the developer didn't want to listen to them, and I've had that type of experience as well. Anyway, this is me as a developer, and kind of me with my dog. I've got my cool laptop with all of my nerdy stickers on it, and when I started off doing web development, it was an outlet for me to be creative. Like, it was this idea that, oh my gosh, I can just start writing code and things appear somewhere. And that was the stuff that I was interested in. And I could just, like, this computer was my whole world. And I just thought, like, that's all I needed. All right, so everybody else is a developer here, I'm assuming. Since there's a lot of you, I'll just kind of put it out. You can either nod your heads or go like that. Have you ever found it being difficult working with a UX designer or a designer, and it's like they don't understand the complexities of my work? So it's kind of like we're both on these two sides. Like, well, I can't talk to you. You don't understand me. And, well, you don't understand this whole situation. You don't understand my craft. So for me, my code is my craft. And if you read, you might not be able to read this because it's so blurry, but it's an email template, and notoriously, yeah, emails are kind of ugly. But when I see like things tabbed in and I craft my code really well, and just on Thursday I was working and I did all of this Git rebasing and rewriting history, and I'm like, oh, this is beautiful. And it's like, to me, that's my craft, and it's a beauty that, it's like, oh, designers don't understand what we're putting together here, and we're artistic people as well. But it's just kind of like we have to have insight into how we work, and I've seen some designers who are just very exact in how they do their designs as well, where they have a science and they're methodical and they think about this. And so we have it on these two sides, and it's something to keep in mind as we're talking to one another. So I've spent, and I bring this up because developers I've been teaching Ruby on Rails at General Assembly in Manhattan for a couple of years now, and I meet a lot of new developers who are coming in, and I always ask them at the beginning of the class, like, why do you want to get into development? And a lot of times, everybody has a different answer, so these are just some of them. A lot of them is like make money, but they want to work independently. It's like, I have something I want to create. And it's very like, nobody really says I want to work on a team. So that's kind of interesting. I put this slide in here, and you might not be able to see it that well due to the lighting, but this is our office at Paperless Post. And when I first became a developer, I worked at places that had cubicles, and I never thought like I would need anything more than myself. Like, I knew how to do everything, right? I'm really smart. If I would show this picture to some people, to a lot of people, probably they would be freaking out, because it's like, wow, you guys are so close to one another. It's an open office. It's like, how do you get any work done? Just leave me alone. And I was absolutely like that whenever I first started working in this space. But whenever I started transitioning how I was working with other people, this became less and less of a problem. And so we'll go through that more, because for a while there, these are fireflies. We're just kind of like zooming around, like just kind of independently working and not really caring about the other person. And I'd much rather see it where we're all cogs in like a clockwork, beautifully working together, where something that I am concentrating on is relies on somebody else's work, and then I directly affect somebody else's work. So I can't tell you that I have all the answers, but I can hopefully share you some tips. And my first topic is fences and waterfalls. There we go. So this probably looks pretty familiar. We start from the left, and you pretty much just keep going to the right and you never look back. So content, UX, UI, design, front end, blah, 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 and then we ship it. So this is pretty similar to like what the waterfall method is. And I was kind of disappointed because I was looking for like a really ruthless waterfall on Flickr, and I couldn't find one. So I found this one instead. And that's kind of like how I feel. This is from an Icebook challenge. Kind of feel whenever like I have no control over the type of work that I'm getting, and I can't ever like go back and ask the people like, where did you get these ideas from? Like, ask questions about it. And I think it doesn't matter what part of the waterfall you're in, everybody kind of feels helpless about the type of work they do. So what happens is it kind of becomes this us versus them mentality. And that's where I was talking about what do designers think of developers and what do developers think of designers. And for a while, there was like no time that we were talking to one another. And for also a longer portion, we were even on opposite floors and we had no contact with one another. It was like things were being thrown over fences. And the designer would throw it over and walk away. It was like they didn't even care how it turned out. But like if they noticed something on the website, they're like, that's not how I designed it, what happened? But it would be like 5 months after the project ended. So it was like really odd and really difficult to get anything together. So here's my story. And I ended up going to a SaaS meetup in New York City. Claudina is the organizer there. So I have her to thank for all of this. And I was there with another coworker, and we were just, whenever the floor was open for questions, I just got up and I'm like, please help me. We want to roll out responsive design on our website. We think it's so important, but none of our designers understand why we think it's important. And Sam, who is your co-organizer, said, just sit down with them. Just do design in browser. And I was like, oh, what do you mean by that? And it's just like you just sit there and you show them what it is and what it takes to change stuff on the website. And it's like so simple, yet so hard to actually think about how I was actually going to get this designer to break out of their world and sit down next to me for a couple hours. Like that seems unheard of whenever you have like such an ingrained culture of like you have your space, you have your work to do. Now we're changing it up and somehow we're going to work together in totally different disciplines. So what I did is waited a little bit, and around January, so after the holiday rush, so we're a card company, Thanksgiving and Christmas is nuts, and probably for a lot of other industries as well, I started blocking off time in my calendar, and I somehow got buy-in from one of the directors who then told the other, so that's probably one of the more harder things to do is to get buy-in. But what I will tell you is that if you're enthusiastic about certain things, and as soon as you get 1 or 2 people on, it does grow. So holiday time was magical. All of our big things that we had to push out got pushed out, and the designers were getting like really antsy because they're like, oh, we got these really old styles on the site. We'd really like to get rid of them. So we sat down. We did this every week for a couple months where we had this time blocked off in the morning, and we just sat there and talked about stuff that we wanted to work on. So during this time, we just talked about things that bothered us and the simple things that we could have just improved to make us feel better about the site. So this included removing some buttons, removing some gradients and things like that. During this time, the designer can communicate their designs to you. It's an opportunity to say, well, I don't really understand what you're trying to say here. Can we just walk through it? Let me see if I can mock this out for you. So the effects were that this was much more successful than I could have ever imagined. What I wanted to get out of it was just much more understanding between us, and I got a lot more. So we got a lot done. We were able to pull a bunch of old styles off, and we were able to incorporate new processes into it. So the designers were able to really see how long it took us to get stuff done. And okay, let's work together on how this menu opens. Oh, you know what? Since we want to do responsive, instead of hovering, we should make sure that we click on it instead of that. So people are part of their own like specialty teams. So now you can just kind of grab them and say, hey, let's work on this. And then what I see a lot of people do now, which is just, it all started just from us pairing with designers, just see like a bunch of people go into a conference room, block 2 or 3 hours off. It could be like 3 people and do this mob programming thing and just try to figure out what's going on with this area of the site. It's great. So here's some tips and tricks on how to actually have a successful either design in browser or pair programming or mob programming session. So before the meeting, figure out what you're going to work on. Don't just like go in there and be like, okay, we're going to fix stuff, because that's not really helpful. Say like, okay, we have, let's remove all the gradients on our receiver side. Okay, I think we can do that in 2 or 3 hours. Sometimes a session can be exploratory though, but as long as you have like an idea of what you want to tackle. And then sometimes you need to set more of an expectation of what you want to accomplish. So whenever I'm sitting with another developer, I might tell them, well, I really want to refactor this part of the code. Even though we're still trying to figure out what this is, let's just tackle these sections. Set a time limit. Don't just kind of like force 2 people in a room together and expect them to work together. Sometimes you just gotta like give them that expectation. They got other meetings to go to. Come prepared. Bring your laptop. Bring your tool sets that you like to use. Have everything set up for everybody to use. And this type of environment can happen for any type of pairing session. So we started off with developer and designer. I see now different types of developers just sitting with each other, and I've even seen the designers just kind of hash stuff out in the kitchen, which is really awesome, and everybody's just trying to talk together, where before I think they were working a lot more independently with their own designs. A few more. Take breaks. I was pair programming with another developer for 4 hours, and at the end we were both sitting there brain dead because we were working so hard. When you work independently, I usually do the Pomodoro technique, and I just give myself time to rest, but if you're really concentrating, it's just at the end, you're just done. Really take the time that if you're a developer working with a designer, make sure that they understand what you're doing. Have your moment where they tell you where the bug is. I mean, that's awesome. If they know what goes into your work, that just makes it so much easier. Discuss these technical limitations with the designer so they understand any type of issue that you're facing. Show these changes in the browser in real time. If you can, grab a conference room. Grab a big TV and so people can see it so you're not huddled around your laptop like this. It gets really uncomfortable. Mixed disciplines. We sometimes just have a whole mess of people in a room and we're just talking through stuff. We'll have the visual designer, the UX person, and the developer in there, and we're just trying to figure out what this piece of code does. So now that we figured out how a designer and a developer work together, this section is more about how developers can talk better to each other. So take the time and write out your style guides. So has anybody heard of a coding style guide before? Do you have it at your companies? Maybe. Okay, so what are coding style guides? So these set up the basic rules for how your code should be uniform. What could this be? How files should be set up. So what's your directory structure? Whether you use tabs or spaces, and that, figure it out. What are your best practices, how you name your variables, and so much more. So why is this coding style guide so important? Your code review can then be spent on things much more important versus arguing over stupid little stuff, because you have a document that is the arbiter. It's if it's not in the style guide, get it out of your code. And this is a contract, and it's an agreement that you make as developers that you've agreed upon certain things, and this is how you're going to work. And this way, I can go look at somebody else's code, and if we're all writing it in the same way, we understand what's going on here. So it's a lot easier to be brought into projects. So how do you actually go about adding a style guide? We had one, whenever I got there, we had one for Ruby, and we kind of had one there for CSS. But what you could do is take a look at other companies' coding styles. GitHub and Google have them, and that's really easy to just say, well, Google's doing it, at your own. And then put it in a public place. Don't just say, this is the style guide we agreed on. Put it on a wiki, your company's intranet, a gist, something so that people always have access to it. Make it public. So this is a list of all of the new SaaS style guide requirements that I put together for a new writing SaaS, and now we have 5 or 6, and that adds complexity. So we set some rules in place about how we want this to be written. And whenever you set rules like this, you're also taking down the complexity of your CSS selectors, which could, like, if you've ever used Sass before, you can get like really deeply nested. What you want to do is rewrite styles. It's like, you don't want to rewrite styles, you want to have reusable styles everywhere. It's the same as if you're writing classes in other programming languages. But people pick it up. And the great thing that happens, again, amazing stuff happens, these people start telling each other to take care of this stuff right off the bat. And this then helps other people who don't write CSS or Sass all the time. That helps them to learn, because now I have more soldiers out in the field who are going around and telling them how to do certain things. So things that we have to improve on is that we have way too many opinionated JavaScript libraries and opinionated people who write JavaScript, that our whole JavaScript file system is just crazy. It's crazy pants. We just recently rolled out a new way we did checkout on the site, so you buy a card or you buy coins and need to pay for it. And it became to be a really difficult, I have like my styles in 3 different files and 3 different directories, all called the same thing. And it just and we had like mustache templates, but also jQuery, and then all of these other things. But you just end up writing crap code to try to fix bugs here and there. We now have this tag where it's JS dash, and all the front end people know that you do not touch that tag and you do not attribute styles to them. Yeah, the designers are really chomping at the bit to get this removed, and this new nav would replace it. But it pertains to when we're creating a card, which is an event. We have the event page, which is what the receiver sees whenever they receive an event. We have a dash section of the site and no holistic control over the entire site, which has become such a problem. How to use it. Also include the designer notes in it. So what was the designer thinking? Where should this button only be put?